In The Politics of Translation, Spivak elaborates the concept of translation as reading, and quotes her own translator's preface to a collection of 18th century Bengali poetry. In her opinion, the translator must surrender to the text that they are translating. In this way, translating becomes the most intimate act of reading. In her words, this intimacy is an act of baring yourself to the source text and the language, more specifically the rhetoricity of the author, which in return allows the translator to become an intimate reader. To be an intimate reader is a right to be earned. In her words, the translator earns permission to transgress from the trace of the other, i.e., takes the language of the original and tries to transfer its meaning through themselves and into another language, before memory, in the closest place of the self, i.e., in the intimacy and private place of their own mind and soul. For Spivak, the intimacy as an act of proximity and necessary distance is both a matter of love and an act of gendered agency. The task of the translator is defined by love. The goal of the translator is to facilitate the love between the original and its shadow, the translation itself. Other factors that motivate translation can be racial, historical, linguistic, or economic, throwing the translation into an ethno-political arena. Let's take a look at the translation as reading process. It all starts with reading, a particular act of reading where the translator goes under the surface of the text and understands it at its core. While reading, the translator is attracted to the text like a moth to a flame and makes space in their mind for the added value that is the author's, the other's, cultural and linguistic perspective. Thomas Keenan, in this regard, advocates for a kind of reading that is not only a private action and is limited to the confines of the self, but instead that exposes us to the openness of the other. Gradually, the reader as translator establishes a bond with the language of the chosen text that can be either an interpretative process set into motion while engaging with the text, or a total surrender to the spirit of the text while trying to render its meaning into another language. Spivak, and in general writers engaged in cultural subalternity, stresses the importance of inhabiting the milieu de source language text, because the translator who does not become part of the context of the text may very well fail in its translation. It is also a private experience, precisely an intimate act, that must be rendered available to the public at a later time. The result, the final translation, is a reflection of the transformation process that the reader-translator has gone through. Consequently, the work of the translator is influenced by emotions and becomes a sort of process in which the translator walks through a trauma. In other words, the translator works through the traumatic effect of seduction, which has touched them deeply and constitutes the translator's starting point of engagement with the other's text. It is not enough to be bilingual in order to write an efficient translation. A translator has to be able to speak the language specific to a field or not the specific terrain of the original to be critical and form their own opinion. This way, there is a special relationship between the two languages, which through the person of the translator may result in that intimacy. For example, Spivak herself is a famous translator of Bengali poetry, but that is not enough in the case of, for example, legal translation. Vice versa, a proficient translator of English legalese isn't likely to produce a quality translation of English poetry. To quote Spivak, if we were thinking of translating Marianne Moore or Emily Dickinson, the standard for the translator could not be anyone who can conduct a conversation in the language of the original, in this case English. The intimacy of cultural translation starts with learning the other's language. However, Spivak warns that there is a difference between academic learning for academic purposes and actually learning a language with all the cultural and emotional baggage that comes with it. instead of advocating for better translators, she seems to suggest that the best way to avoid problems in translation can be reached by everyone learning more languages and by learning to push through to the original. It is important to point out that for Spivak the translator surrenders to the text, to the language and the rhetoric, not to the author. Spivak's method of translating can be summarized as: Step 1. Translation at speed. Refuting any discussion about Scopus theory, her first step is to do a literal translation without caring too much about what is happening to the English. Step 2. Revision of the literal translation, not with an audience in mind, but in conformity with the rules of the English language. Another famous translator that deals with post-colonial literature is Lawrence Venuti. Venuti's notion of simpatico presents similarities with Spivak's idea of a connection between translator and text. Venuti brings up the concept that it is supposedly very desirable, at the beginning of a career as translator, to find an author with whom the translator shares a common sensibility. This underlying sympathy is supposedly beneficial in order to increase the fidelity to the original, because a close connection between writer and translator facilitates the process of impersonation that is inevitable during a translation. However, Venuti criticizes this concept and considers the reason why in the British and American culture it is more acceptable to hide the translator, this so-called translator's invisibility, i.e., the notion that the translation should read as an original, try not to be perceived as a translation. The notion of simpatico defines a deep similarity between author and a translator, a sort of identity between them. However, Venuti warns that such a complete identification with the foreign author's thoughts and feelings must always be limited in respect to the original work. Venuti in the end rejects the concept of simpatico as sole parameter for legitimate translation, while Spivak defends her idea of intimacy until the bitter end, but both agree that the other is a necessary relation between original and translation. It is at this point that Spivak and Venuti take different paths. For Spivak, translation is a necessary impossibility, meaning that it contains in itself its own negation. For Venuti, translation is a powerful means of political action and literary creation due to exactly that resistance to assimilation and homogenization. In other words, the translation's independence from the foreign work is for Venuti the highest value, while for Spivak is a negation of the nature of translation itself. As a conclusion, a personal critic. The peculiar nature of translation lies in the fact that there is no single way to go about it. There are numerous approaches and strategies that end in different results, and all of them can be correct translations. Spivak's way to look at translation is one of the many, and it is a valid one in the field of literary translation. However, not all translators work in the literary field. In my case as a student, I work more on semi-technical texts, where the concept of surrender is quite hard to apply. In the event of a future translation of literary texts, I look forward to trying out Spivak's method.